My name is Anna Vinyals. I'm formerly Professor of Education at Cambridge, but in my day job, I'm Director of the Alleviate Trust, which is a research funder here in the UK. And I have to say, as one of the largest charitable research funders in the UK, I do spend a lot of time these days worrying about the financial sustainability of the higher education sector, as do many of the people in this room. So it's a great time to come together and try and thrash out, what we can learn from some of the economics, but also, as we're about to hear, from some of the politics. And I wanted to just say a couple of things. The first thing is, I think all of us, when we think about what a good higher education system looks like, are thinking about something that is sustainable, something that is reasonably equitable, and quality provision is also an important part of that. And what we mean by quality is perhaps debatable, but I think we all want a high quality system. And I think during the course of today, it's also become apparent that one of the issues that we need to think about is, do we also mean a really big mass system, and what would that look like across the different types of provision? And do we need mass systems to ensure a reasonable chance of access from people from lower income backgrounds or from more disadvantaged circumstances? So I think the goal of what we're trying to achieve is relatively clear, and we could probably all agree on most of that. The question is, how do we get there? And that's obviously a lot trickier. And as we go into the UK election, it's really obvious that I don't think any of the parties necessarily have a plan to ensure a sustainable, quality, equitable higher education system, and maybe we can help them with that today. Well, fingers crossed anyway. The other thing I think we really need to be mindful of is what we can learn from other countries. We've got certainly, as Bruce so eloquently outlined earlier today, many countries grappling with this issue. So this isn't really just a lesson for the UK, of course, it's much wider than that. How do you go to mass systems? How do you fund it? How do you fund it sustainably? And then I think the other thing we touched on this morning was this issue of social return. I'm not sure how present our debates about social return are in arguments about higher education funding, and we might come back to that. But also, how do we have a tertiary education system, not just a higher education system that's fit for purpose, as Sue talked about so well this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. Okay, so to help us answer all those questions, we have an amazing panel of people. And for those of you who are concerned that economists get all the good shots, we've got history, political science, and economics represented on the panel today. So hopefully we're going to get a number of different perspectives on these problems. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each speaker as they are about to speak. They're all going to speak for about 6 minutes, and I will get a little bit narky if they go longer. And the first up is Sam Freedman. Sam, as many of you will already know, is a real polymath with huge amounts of UK policy experience. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, but he was also a senior policy advisor to the DFE, and the Secretary of State, no less. And he then became an executive director at Teach First. So very well placed to give views on exactly how or how not UK policymakers are going to address what looks to be an increasingly precarious situation in higher education in the UK. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much. Yes, they've invited me to lower the tone and talk about politics and the grubby realities of it. So I really wanted to talk about the choices that a Labour government are going to have when they almost certainly arrive in power in about 6 months' time. There's not an awful lot of point talking about the remaining months of the current government. They are desperately trying to survive for the next few months and are not going to be doing anything very dramatic on the policy front. I mean, they can make things worse, definitely, but they're unlikely to make anything better. So really we're talking about what are Labour going to do when they arrive? What are the options that they have? And I think it's really important to sort of set the context for that sort of set of decisions. Labour advisors, Labour politicians are well aware of a lot of the problems and challenges that you've all been looking at today. The fact that you have a system that is obviously financially unsustainable in the long term because tuition fees are stuck, not inflation linked, and obviously the big rise in inflation and the recent drop in international students as a matter of government policy has added to that financial difficulty. That is sort of understood. The problem is that it's number sort of 37 on the list of disasters that they are about to walk into inheriting. They are going to be in a situation where they're going to have to prioritise quite tightly, particularly when it comes to financial issues. They will have to probably do a one-year spending review almost straight away after getting into government, because there are no budgets for anybody from April 2025 onwards, so no one anywhere in the public sector can plan for anything at the moment. So there'll have to be a sort of initial, very quick one-year spending review, and then there'll be probably a 3-year spending review the following year, when they'll have a bit more time, but there'll still be an enormous amount of pressure. They will be, I'm going to make the assumption that they're going to win. Of course, it's politics, anything can happen, but I'm going to assume they're going to win. They will be coming into a situation where the spending figures that they will be inheriting are fantasy, they're nonsense. They're not remotely achievable. And even to sort of not do the cuts that the Tories have penciled into departments like Justice, Home Office, etc., that have already been cut a lot over the last 15 years, will cost about £25 billion just to not do that. So you think, okay, well, Labour, they might raise taxes a bit more than they're currently saying because they're in election mode. They might borrow a bit more money than they're currently saying because they're in election mode. Even if they do, that covers like just keeping us still and not doing the damage that is currently penciled into current numbers. You then look at all of the problems in the public sector, the fact that local government is on the verge of collapse, the fact the SEND system is on the verge of collapse, the fact that NHS is, still has record waiting lists, record waiting times for cancer patients, etc., etc., etc. You can go through every single department, and they have a really, really good case for why they need more money at the spending review that Labour are going to have to be doing. And they just aren't going to be able to do all of those things. Even if when you get into the DFE, assuming that HE stays in the DFE, which is an assumption because if there is going to be a machinery of government change, it will happen early on. But let's assume HE stays within the Department for Education. Even there, looking at your spending review bid, that as an advisor, as a minister, you're going to have to be making to the Treasury, you're looking at, you have to ask for a lot of money for childcare because there's a pledge to increase childcare to 1- and 2-year-olds. So that isn't in the baseline. That's got to be something you request. Schools will want a real terms, at least flat in school funding. They will not want a drop in school funding. That will be quite a fight because the Treasury will say pupil numbers are falling, so we'll have that back, please. So they'll have to have a fight over that. They have to have a big fight over capital spending because the school estate is in a total mess and you've got buildings that are in critical risk of falling over. So you've got a bunch of other fights you've got to have even within the DFE. And then you get HE and you think, where's that on our list of priorities? How much money do we want to ask for even for this, given that we're going to have fights on so many other fronts? So I think realistically, almost certainly what will happen is they will say, okay, we know this is a problem, it's time for another review, because we haven't had enough reviews of HE funding over the years. And in fairness, they do need to do another review. It doesn't necessarily need to be a very long review. It doesn't need to be sort of 4 or 5 years. It doesn't need to be sort of full brown all over again. But they do need to have serious consideration of all of the long-term options, none of which are hugely attractive, and to understand, for ministers and the Prime Minister and Chancellor to understand what those different trade-offs are. So they will legitimately say, we need to do a proper review of this. The question is, do you do something in the short term? What are your options for doing something in the short term? So I think realistically, if I was an advisor, I'd be saying you've got 3 options in the short term, not for the big review. You've got to do the big review. Your 3 options are, you don't do anything, you wait for that to happen, and you just hope that nothing terrible happens. You just try and wait out the crisis and say, it's not top of public priorities, we don't think any university is actually going to go completely bust, we think they'll manage for a couple more years, live with it. Second is you say, okay, we'll give you something in the short term while we do the sort of big review, we'll inflation link tuition fees and maintenance. That costs a bit of money. It doesn't cost a vast amount of money because inflation is not going to be that high over the next few years. But at least it gives universities a bit of certainty over hiring for a couple of years while you do your sort of bigger piece of work. Obviously, raising tuition fees, even just by inflation linking, will be unpopular with the party. It will be unpopular with the public. You take a political hit on that. So there's a cost there. But equally, it gives you a bit more security on the universities not actually collapsing side. And then your final option would be essentially to do that, but just to use taxpayer-funded money instead of tuition fees, and say we're going to do something like, we're going to call it a made-up name, call it the Transformation Fund or something, and just find a way to give a couple of £100 million a year extra to universities that are in financial difficulty. These are all clearly short-term mechanisms, but that's the kind of first decision they're going to have to make. Then you're into a set of decisions about the longer term, and I suspect we will come to that later. So I will stop at that point.
Well, again, rather depressing, but very eloquently.
I'm trying to be honest here.
Very eloquently said. Thank you, Sam. Okay, so we've heard what the options are, short term, long term. We can come back to. The next speaker I'm delighted to welcome is Ed Dorrell. Ed Dorrell's a former education journalist. He's written for most of the UK newspapers, I think, and was deputy editor of the Times Education Supplement. And he's now a partner at Public First, which is a strategy consultancy. But he's here because they did some fascinating work with London Economics, looking at the political public acceptability of some of the alternative options about how we fund higher education. So hopefully, Ed, you're going to tell us a bit about what students stroke other people feel about the options that might or might not be on the table, at least in the longer run that Sam was referring to.
Yeah, first of all, it wasn't with London Economics, it was a think tank called Progressive Britain, and I'm not going to talk about students because we know what they think. They want to get rid of tuition fees. I just want to start not on that, I want to start on something else. A little while ago, a very eccentric education philanthropist, not Becky's boss, funded me to interview 10 living
Your mic, I think, is not working.
10 living ex-education secretaries. And I think one of the most interesting was Charles Clarke, who those of you with long memories will remember was heavily involved with bringing in the tuition fee regime. And he talked at length to me about how he always understood tuition to be a tripartite, university funding to be a tripartite thing. It should have a contribution from the state, or from the nation rather, that benefits, from the students themselves, who obviously benefit, but from business, from the corporate sector. And he thought it should be a tripartite contribution. And one of his regrets was that he'd never got to the point where business or the corporate world or employers made a contribution to cover the benefits that they enjoy from graduates being trained. Interestingly, and perhaps to my surprise actually, that was one of the things that normal voters most liked in this huge piece of work that we did with Progressive Britain, talking to voters and, yes, students, but normal people, students and others, about their views on how universities should be funded. And we carried it out last summer and reported at Labour Party conference. The first thing to report was the idea of abolishing tuition fees and handing responsibility essentially to the taxpayer, maybe business, but abolishing tuition fees was wildly popular with voters. They really liked the idea of getting rid of tuition fees, up to the point when you asked them to trade off against any other public investment option, at which point they said, no, we'll have the other one, please. So, X billion pounds to get rid of tuition fees against the NHS. We'll fund the NHS, please. X billion pounds to fund better armed forces versus getting rid of tuition fees. The MOD gets the cash. Every option. So in isolation, getting rid of tuition fees, very popular. Traded off against just about anything else that the British state could fund, it loses out. So this idea that abolishing tuition fees is a popular policy is completely nonsense. It is worth, as an aside, if we're talking about sustainability, sustainable HE funding model, and given the state of some university finances that Sam alluded to, the vice chancellors who stand up and say what we need is an increase in tuition fees are for the birds, essentially. There is exactly no appetite in any public discourse for increasing fees. So something else is going to have to come along. The trouble that universities have when they're talking about this subject is that in too many quarters of the country for them to understand, universities are still seen as somewhat other. And in other quarters, they're seen as really very affluent. People, normal people, voters, non-graduates often, but even some graduates, don't understand how universities could be skint. They charge £9 a month, sorry, £9 a term. They'd like to charge £9 a month. They see, I mean, being honest, they see new buildings being thrown up in their town centres. They see them being thrown up in their city centres. They don't see an organisation that looks poor, that looks like it's on its uppers. So making an argument for increased funding, either from the taxpayer or from students themselves, is really, really hard. There is no after, and that's one of the reasons why, as Sam says, an incoming Labour government is not going to increase funding. There are universities out there that aren't other. They are often post-92s, not exclusively, but often post-92s. Universities that are really embedded in their communities, where they have a much stronger relationship with their local people. We do a lot of work with Teesside University, for example, speaking to people in Teesside about their relationship with the university. And that is very, very strong. And that points to another of the findings from the work we did with Progressive Britain, and another of the trade-offs we asked people to talk about. I'll pick between. And given a choice between further education funding and apprenticeships and skills, and increasing funding for that, versus increased funding for universities, or increases in tuition fees, they will always go with skills as the option that they choose. Apprenticeships are wildly, wildly popular. FE, despite years and years and years of the government emasculating it, is wildly popular with British voters, way more so than universities. And there, through the work we've done with Teesside, and I'll tell you, if I've got time for a quick anecdote.
About 30 seconds.
So I've done a lot of work talking to a lot of voters and normal people about their local university over the years in focus groups. And one quote stands out, lots do, but one in this context stands out. It was a retired metal worker in Teesside, and he had never been to university, and I expected him, because of my experience, to have very limited sympathy for the local university, but he loved Teesside University. He loved it. He used this quote, "It is the pride of Teesside," is what he said. And then it transpired that his kids had gone through the university, had done vocational qualifications, nursing, allied healthcare professions, and others. And he understood it as a supplier of local skills into his local place. And this is the route, I think, for HE, if it wants to win arguments about funding, and I've talked to Andy about this in the past, if it wants to win arguments about funding, it needs to win the war for public support. And the way to do that is to embed yourself in your local community and to work in FE and skills.
Thank you. Lessons for us all there. So we're going to come back and have a lot of questions, I suspect, about those first two contributions. But first of all, we're going to turn again to Susan, who doesn't need, obviously, an introduction, for those of you who've been here for a while. But what I think is worth highlighting is Sue has worked absolutely tirelessly at the border between academia and policy in the US, and she's been very recognised for her ability to influence, which is something we could all do with a bit of over this side of the Atlantic as well. And so there really isn't anybody better placed to talk about the tertiary education funding policy. So moving slightly broader, going beyond the sort of narrow definitions of HE we've been really referring to so far, and think about the importance of higher level vocational education. So over to you, Sue.
So, you know, seeing the statistics that were put up earlier in our day together on what share of people are getting a university degree, it looks like it's maybe at 30% now. Is that the of those who go to university of the entire population?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And they're graduating with their BAs or with a, and then the other 50%, it's basically further ed or nothing. So this is kind of a recipe for a lot of inequality right? So if you're concerned about earnings inequality in your country, having these two classes is quite dicey, and it really, you need skills training in between. That's pretty obvious. And question is how, one question is how to fund it. Another is how to provide it. So governments are, do I have a problem again? She has a problem. Okay. So governments don't want to build things. They don't want to expand. They don't want to create new programs. You saw all the weird things that were going on with the student loans to try to make it look like the budget was not growing, right? So there's no appetite for like starting in the U.S. and I think in the U.K. as well for sort of starting new institutions, building new things, right? And so then the answer becomes contracting it out to the private sector instead, which shows up differently on the books, right? The contract that you can sort of turn off at any moment. And then the problem there becomes the regulation of quality. And so when we have the public institutions providing education, there's no profit incentive to skim off as much money as possible and not provide an education. But what we found in the US, and it sounds like Anna and I were chatting a bit about the experience here in the UK as well, that the government and students have been ripped off by fraudulent commercial providers who don't really provide any real training. So there needs to be, there needs to be an appetite for regulation. And I think that because our higher education system, your higher education system, we sort of Oxfords and Cambridges, and you don't go in there to sort of see if they're providing a good education. That doesn't translate very well the further you expand access to post-secondary education, to tertiary education. Education, like healthcare, right? It's a trust exchange. People who go in to get surgery don't know how to tell what a good surgeon is. They rely on the government and other boards and so forth to certify who can provide a good medical procedure. And similarly, especially first-generation students. I was a first-generation student. I ended up going to Harvard undergraduate, but my dad was a high school dropout, didn't finish secondary school. I didn't know what a good education looked like. I couldn't, what I'm saying here is that the market doesn't do the job, right? You cannot count on, I think, the market to be pushing out bad providers of education. People don't tend to repeatedly engage in this market. It's not like buying crisps. So, oh, those are terrible. I'm not going to buy them, and I'm going to tell my friends all about them. It's something you do, like maybe once when you come out of secondary school. And if nobody in your town has gone to post-secondary, then you don't have the information you need to judge what's good. So I guess we're going to have government no matter what. It's either going to be provision or it's going to be regulation. People need to understand that if you are going to add more education to the economy, that means the government has to grow, either through provision or regulation. So how does a school, get, it's a pretty high stakes, it should be a high stakes process that a school gets certified to teach and to take these student loan proceeds, these loans that are going to follow students for their lifetimes, right? So this is unlike buying a packet of crisps. You buy, some education and you're stuck with that loan and the government is following you and collecting it for the rest of your life. You can't just decide, this is a lousy car, I'm going to get rid of it. You have the education debt that you acquired, and the force of the government is collecting it. So the government is therefore, I think, responsible for making sure that the education provided is a good one. Education is fundamentally a risky investment for the students, right? Even if tuition is zero, right? Even if you make tuition zero, which would give Bruce conniptions. But even if you set it to zero, no matter what, the students are giving up their wages that they would otherwise be earning out in the labor force. So even with zero tuition, students have skin in the game. In the US, we have these policy discussions that kind of drive me bananas, where it's like, well, students need to have skin in the game. If tuition is zero, they won't have any reason to succeed and to make sure they work hard at their studies. Giving up 4 years or 2 years of earnings is putting quite a bit of skin in the game, and I think students want a quality education, and it's our public responsibility to make sure it happens. So in our system, it's particularly challenging to regulate quality because the government hand that gives out the loans and the grants as well, we have a large grant system, that's the federal government. They give essentially vouchers to students, either in the form of loans or in the form of grants. The arm of government that provides the education is the states and sometimes localities. So you've got one entity that is setting prices and providing the education, and another one that's paying for it. And we economists call this a principal agent problem, right? So, you know, if and what we've run into in the U.S. is that basically students are walking about with these vouchers, but nobody is regulating the quality, in particular, as I said before, of the for-profit institutions that are taking those vouchers, right? We don't have a regulatory structure for those institutions that's nationwide. For the publics, again, we sort of count on the fact that these are public institutions and that their state governments are going to supervise in some way. But for the privates and nonprofits, that mechanism is just not there. I obviously don't know so much about the politics of your country and the funding.
Lucky you.
Well, I know
come
mine.
back to
I know mine
True,
instead.
yeah, yeah.
So
I'd rather
take
have
Trump
ours.
if you
I'd
like.
rather have
Right. You know, this. How do we get funding for the public to buy into funding for our institutions? You know, well, one way is that people see a path, right, for their children into university in some way. So in the U.S., in theory, that path is through the community colleges. So in theory, in the U.S., the idea is that somebody who doesn't have fantastic academic preparation can go to one of the public 2-year colleges, earn credits for a couple of years, and if they do well, then transfer to university and earn a 4-year degree. In practice, this works very well it works very well in New York and California, and everywhere else it's a mess. The community colleges tend to be a dead end. But in theory, having an on-ramp, right, through in your system that lets more people aspire at some point to make it into the universities, and the phrasing I would be using if I were a university here in the UK going to get some more money is not, we want higher fees, but we need more money to teach our students well. And
I like that.
focus on that, right, as opposed to please raise tuition fees. Okay.
No, that's a very good point to end on. Thank you, Sue. And finally, it gives me great pleasure to introduce actually the brains behind this conference, I think you can safely say. Lorraine Dearden. Professor Lorraine Dearden is Professor of Economics and Statistics at UCL, and she's a trustee of the wonderful Nuffield Foundation, and she's been working on higher education finance for, well, a long time. A long time. But she's particularly unique, I think, in terms of her breadth of interest. You were hearing about it via Bruce this morning, so in terms of the countries that you cover, and hopefully you're going to give us a little perspective that goes outside UK and US in terms of countries struggling with this central question of how do you expand and fund and regulate, as Sue rightly said.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to cover the ground that Bruce did in his talk, but, you know, it's very, very interesting. You turn up in a new country. The last one I went to was Indonesia in January, and there's similar problems in virtually every country you go to. They want to fund, and in quite a few countries, particularly in Latin America and Asia, they want to fund high-quality higher education in an affordable and equitable way, and they want to come up with some way of doing it. But the thing that I've realised going to each country is they're very different in terms of culture, in terms of public versus private provision. In the UK, it's all public provision. In the US, it's a mixture. In Colombia, it's a mixture. In Indonesia, it's a mixture. So it really matters in terms of how you get it right. And, you know, there's cultural differences in the expectations which parents are meant to contribute to an education. Like in Japan and the US, there is a real expectation that parents save a lot to put their kids through university. It's being blamed in Japan on why the fertility rate has gone down so much, because it's so expensive to get through. So it's every country is very, very different. So, you know, you've got to have a fresh approach. And I just want to point out one of the common obstacles we come across when we go to a country, and it's because they look to the US. So they think that a student loan must only last for 10 years, okay? They sort of say, oh, we can't have an income, because an income contingent loan, the way it makes it affordable is for the majority of people, not all, you have to repay over a much longer term. And, you know, the immediate reaction is, we're never going to, that's just going to be so unpopular, you know. But I think so one of the difficult issues you need to get across is that investing in your education is not like a car loan. It's a lifelong investment. And I like to think of it like a reverse pension. You know, with a pension, you make a contribution over your life, so you've got earnings in retirement. Well, with education, you need an upfront investment so that you can do it, and then you have to contribute over a much longer time than you would with a normal loan. So it's impressing on them that having a longer time frame is good, and that's how you ensure that students never face unpayable student loan repayment. So that is always a difficulty, convincing them about that. However, what that means in most countries is that there's going to be a short term, and it's quite short term in a lot of countries, funding shortfall. And so I say, you know, well, what's your discount rate? How you know, they sort of say, you know, we need to get the money in quickly. And I say, well, you know, what is your discount rate? How much do you value getting someone today versus, you know, in a year's time? And then I put it in the model, and I said, this still gets you more money. So you know, they with the problem with changing policy is that politicians want change immediately and for it to cost nothing, and it takes time. Once you know, there's a short period where they will lose money, but then it becomes self-financed. But, you know, making up the shortfall is really, really difficult. In Colombia, their interest rates now have gone through the roof for the student loan company. So even though we can show in 15 years' time it will be completely not costly, it's how they make up that funding shortfall, and that really impacts on getting change. The final point I want to make, and it relates to what Sue's saying, and I think it's the one thing we got wrong with UK reforms, in that I think when we first introduced loans in 1998, but the sort of first proper rollout in 2004, we should have designed a system that covered both further and higher education. A lot of the post-92s that we're talking about had really good vocational and education, which they subsequently repackaged as a degree. I think if those institutions had received proper funding, like the universities did when the fees were introduced, by being allowed to introduce fees, if students could get maintenance and loans to live on, a lot of students would have chosen a much more appropriate vocational route, but instead chose to go to university because that was the only way they could afford to go. I know it's got all the problems of having to be properly regulated, but I think we made a huge mistake there, and I actually think we need to refocus. It will involve lots of tight regulation, but when I go to a country, like in Colombia, we've made sure that it is affordable for vocational routes, which, as we've seen in the UK, it's a schooling deficit that stops people getting access. You've got to have, as Sue said, well-trodden paths, but you've got to make sure that the institutions providing them are well-funded. and the students have money to live off while they're doing it. With the vocational route at the moment, they have neither.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. So some interesting points and lots of difficult questions. We will take questions from the floor. So while you're thinking about it, I want to get started with one because, Ed, you've brilliantly illustrated why state funding for higher education doesn't work, because you get to a crunch point, and that crunch point, I think, in the UK, for example, has been since 2008, and there's just no appetite for any increase in funding, and so the quality and the funding erodes and the quality erodes. Sam, you also made the point that there's the short term and the long term, and what you can do politically in the short term is extremely limited. I'd like to start with you, Sam. What's your view on, for example, ways through that conundrum, thinking a little bit longer term than what can people do next year? How do you actually get the system so we don't end up in this scenario again, even if it's going to be bumpy for the next few years? Can we design it in such a way that you don't have this inherent tension built into it?
I'm not sure there's any, I wish I had a magic solution to this. Like, I think, yeah, either the taxpayer has to pay for it, or students have to pay for it, or international students have to pay for it, right? Those are your options. We've been quite reliant on the latter. That's dropping, and I suspect even if Labour don't push any further on that direction to try and bring immigration down, I think it's still, not going to be as valuable to UKHE as it has been over the past few years, which means you're back with the taxpayer pays for it or students pay for it. I do think that I wasn't directly involved in sort of designing any of the tuition fee stuff, but I was supportive of it. And I think the mistake that a lot of policy wonks made, and I was certainly made at the time, was this was the one Jack referred to, which was to worry far too much about progressiveness in the system, and for that to be an objective of a tuition fee system over making it as politically palatable as possible, and those are not the same two things. The people who care about progressiveness of the system are not the people you have to convince of the political palatability of it. And there are other ways you can make the world more progressive. We do not worry about the progressiveness of buying a car. You need to make sure that no one is put off going to university by the fact of their economic circumstance through maintenance, and by making sure that you don't have to pay under a threshold. But beyond that, we definitely worried too much about that and didn't think about the optics of very high interest rates and big numbers of debt, even though intellectually you can sort of explain that all away. So I think if we are going to stick with students paying for it, which I think is almost certainly the most likely outcome because there just are so many demands on taxpayer funding, that we should be thinking about the politics of how we sell that and make it sustainable and inflation-linked, et cetera, in a way that is understandable more clearly to more people than the first round was, which was designed to appeal to people like me, which is not what you should be trying to do.
It's not the average voter.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. And just for those who are joining and weren't in the discussion earlier, by progressivity, you're talking about progressivity of the repayment, i.e. when people are graduates. You're not talking about inequitable access, which we want to...
No, absolutely, no. Yeah. I'm talking about talking about of repayment, and as the point was made earlier, you can do things on that through having a fairer tax system. You don't need to do that through this policy.
Okay. So, Ed, let me put the question that actually Sue's just posed to you. Basically, the way to get the public on board with the idea that fundamentally tertiary education, higher education, is a social good and requires some level of social subsidy and social support is via the access route. In other words, when everybody feels that their children might be able to get some benefit from the system somehow through whatever ladder you've constructed, that's the way to get the political and the public support. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, broadly, that's kind of what I outlined at the end of my introduction. I think bringing down the walls between universities and their communities in which they exist potentially changes the narrative, for sure. I was quite struck by the point just made about bringing FE into the tuition-free model, which I think is sort of the target of the lifelong learning entitlement. And that relates entirely to how I finished my introduction. That sense of ownership between community and universities, and sense of access, and sense of that the university is serving its community, is definitely a route towards making an argument for greater public investment. There will always be people who don't want to go into university, though. You know, at the end of the day, education is not compulsory to 21, and at the end of the day, the expectation, therefore, will be that the students themselves pay for the bulk of it.
Thanks, Ed. And Sue, just coming to you for a moment. It's really interesting the way we talk about tertiary and FE differs quite dramatically on either side of the Atlantic. So from our perspective, we're worried that because our student loan system actually only extended to higher education, we've left those who might access FE at a disadvantage because they can't get a maintenance loan to live, so they're constrained to living at home. They would have to go to their local college, which might not have provision, etc. And they don't get loans for any costs and charges. But your point is that actually it's not a system that works well when you require people to take out loans to study at that level. Are we both right, both wrong? Is there a happy compromise there?
I think you guys have been so long in the mode of the way you get more funding to your institutions is to increase tuition, that you sort of lost track that there might be other ways, like say there should be maintenance grants. I believe you used to have maintenance grants, and so I think what's appropriate for the vocational training and sort of the on-ramp, which is so high risk, right? If you're a student that doesn't have great academic skills, there's a higher likelihood you're going to drop out without finishing a credential. And taking that bet, taking that risk, if you do it through a loan, that shifts that risk onto the student. And I would argue that that risk should be sitting on the government and on society at that level. That the returns are so variable, the payoff is so variable that the risk should not be on the student. So I say zero tuition plus maintenance loan. This is what I recommend in the U.S. for our community colleges, actually, is that we have zero tuition and then not a maintenance loan, maintenance grant for those students. So it can be a unified system for the student in terms of transfer between institutions and so forth. That doesn't mean that we then have to have a one-size-fits-all recipe for how we fund students, because they come from very different circumstances.
Absolutely, and the UK's failed miserably to crack the nut of how you do transferability between institutions, which is a major issue. Last question from me, and then we'll turn to the floor. Lorraine, you've talked about, perhaps the regret that the loan system didn't incorporate FE in a broader tertiary system. But I'm really struck by, the low cost of some of that provision in the US versus the high cost of some of the provision in the UK. And that's driven, I guess, by the fact that, there was a government loan on offer and everybody went to the maximum. So how do you design a system that doesn't encourage universities or institutions or whatever, colleges, to just go to the maximum loan available because, it's an income contingent loan, it's not their money. Maybe the student feels, well, I'm going to pay back over my lifetime anyway, so what difference does it make?
It's very, very difficult. It's very difficult. What I was suggesting with vocational, it should have been available for vocational education and as well as higher education. I think in a
Sorry.
It makes it very difficult, and it needs regulation. Otherwise, they will charge the maximum. However, I think the difference between the US and the UK is we've got an income contingent loan. So if they go to further education, and in a situation they would have that insurance, and the government they would have that insurance. But we have zero fees for further education. And they have been clobbered more than anybody. They've seen Luke's not here, but like real cuts of what, Kate, you'll tell me,
20%.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely huge. And that is a real problem. FE colleges are not properly funded. So it's really difficult, but I imagine there's going to have to be course-specific fee caps that make sure that they're high quality. And abolishing maintenance grants was just a cynical exercise in public accounting. It saved a bit of money, but it was all to do with how the public accounts. There should be a means-tested maintenance loan and then a universal, means-tested maintenance grant and a universal maintenance loan, no means testing to ensure progressivity. You should not have a bigger loan just because you come from a poor background. That was just a cynical political exercise driven by
progressivity on the way in as opposed to the way out.
Way out.
Okay,
Exactly.
so let's talk. There's a gentleman there who's got the microphone, springing into action. Do you want to stick your hand up higher, then she'll know it's you? Thank you. Sorry.
While the mic's
The
going
mics
round,
are here.
while the mic's going round, I would say in the work we did on public attitudes, returning a maintenance grant was wildly popular across the piece.
Yeah.
It was terrible politics and terrible policy.
Right. Okay, and if we can line up the second speaker, who's up? Yep, the lady in front of us. Make it easy.
Hi, my name's Obi. I think this question is for Sam and Ed. Do you think the public would have had an issue with the increase in student numbers if it was for undergraduate students? Because obviously, because it's PG, they come with I don't say literal baggage, but if you had, for example, if you had 4 UG students, they can live in one accommodation where you have 4 en-suite rooms. But then if it's someone with dependents, they can't live in that accommodation, so they would have to, I don't want to say dilute the local stock, I don't want to quote that report, but I don't know if you get what I mean with that question.
Yeah, I'm not convinced the public are bothered about high student numbers. I think there's if that's what you're asking, I think there's a misplaced worry that international students are taking undergraduate places from UK students, which has caused some concern, but that is completely misplaced because, of course, it's for international students are subsidising the UK places. But I don't think, Ed does a lot more focus groups than I sit in, but I don't get the sense that lots of students in itself is something that the public get worried about or upset about. I think it's just fairness of funding and fairness of access.
Yeah, totally. In fact, as with a lot of the right-wing government's culture war, actually they're tilting at windmills. I do a lot of research on this and actually see very little evidence that the great British public objects to foreign undergraduate students in the numbers they're in at the moment. It isn't a wedge issue that's going to win the government election like they might think it will. And I see very little evidence that the great British public objects to increased student numbers, actually. But they don't want to pay more for it.
Encouraging. Lady there.
Hello, Rachel Richards, Durham University. It was actually a point that Ed made. You said about universities embedding themselves very much in the local community and region and providing skills. I just wondered how you see research universities fitting into that. Is it about offering more vocational courses, or is it working with businesses, or is it about sort of impact of research? And I suppose that touches on the point that Sam made about where HE fits. Should there be a reorganisation of government departments going forward? So really just thinking about it in the round, in the bigger picture, given the diversity of institutions there are in the country.
Thank you. We've got another question here, if someone can get the mic over. And meanwhile, I'll just read one from the chat, if I may. I'm paraphrasing Anthony Lewis terribly, so apologies. But basically, he's asking, do we actually have a strategy in terms of, reading between the lines, university supply? He gives the example that in Wales in 1921, there were 2.6 million people and 4 universities. 100 years later, we now have not many more millions, 3.1 million, and we have 8 universities. So there's a question there about the supply side and is provision, coordinated and efficient? And that was the question there, yeah.
Good afternoon.
You have to speak up, my friend.
My question is, should university fees be means tested versus occupational required tested? So if you have an occupation which is very short, whether it should be funded?
Okay, so let's take those in order. Ed, do you want to start?
I obviously don't think Durham or any of the other Russell Group universities perhaps should or could start offering maths vocational qualifications. I think that's fair, but I think universities like Durham need to be doing a lot more work with their community. Durham and others could be doing a lot more on WP than they are in their local communities. They could be working with schools much more closely. They could give a sense that access to the university is something that people in the towns around Durham could achieve. I don't think that's there at the moment. Other universities lead the way, but I think I will zero in on Durham, obviously. But yes, there is an alternative route to that which leads to similar outcomes, I think. I know nothing about Wales in the 1920s.
No, it's all right, we'll take a...
So my great-grandfather was a Welsh education in the 1920s. So.
That does not qualify you, I don't think. I'll come to you in a minute, Simon, but before I do that, I'd like an economist's view on, the general question here is, as we've expanded the supply of university places, has it really, particularly post-2015, with the lifting of the cap, been responding to what each individual institution is pursuing as an institutional strategy versus something that we might want to consider across the sector? Either one of you interested in? I mean, I guess that's the downside of marketizing, right?
Well, I mean, I think what happened with the 2012 reforms, and Jack talked about this, David Willits really thought there would be a market, and he really thought that it would be the, STEM courses that would charge the highest fees, and for humanities it would be the lowest fees. But of course, there was a queue to get to university. There was a queue. And so there was, no cost. And what courses are universities going to expand? Like UCL, it was low cost, highly popular, high earning courses like economics, like business, like law. And what courses did they cut? Not STEM, because the government, the increase in funding for arts and humanities went up by, Ben will tell me, it was about 30 or 40%, whereas the STEM courses got only a modest increase. And so actually, of course, the universities maximised their profit margin, and it didn't, because the market doesn't work. I mean,
So what's your view on that from the US perspective in terms of, I'm very interested in some of the work that we heard about this morning about variation in returns by subject. You talked about lower income students actually struggling to access high return subjects. So you've got a kind of a slightly different version of that problem, but nonetheless driven by, I guess, market, right?
It's not. I mean, again, this is almost all government provided. So 80% of undergraduates, those pursuing a BA, go to a public institution. So the only competitive margin is really this sort of these for-profit institutions that I was referring to. This is, defining how many it's like any other public provision. Where do we put parks, right? Where do we, how many teachers do we have in front of each secondary and primary school classroom, right? So we make this sort of decision about how much money and how many slots we have. So one question I had was how different is the funding for your K-12 system, the primary and secondary system, and how do you have arguments about how that is funded and whether that is indexed? And again, coming back to the point that, a 16-year-old becomes in just a few years a 19-year-old, and should the funding be that different? And should you be thinking of those in a unified way? I don't know what funding is like in your K-12 system. Perhaps it's an even greater nightmare than is what's going on in tertiary. But it's the same framework. These are basically government resources that need to be given out in the face of scarcity. I don't think pricing per major, it never really works, So in the U.S., we do not have differentiation in fees by whether it's an engineering degree or there's very tiny differentiation. Pretty much, at a given university, there's a fee for a BA.
Right. So in answer to your question, our secondary education system is progressive, much more than the US by any measure, but has got marginally less so. But you're right, it's universal funding and we don't debate it. But there is still the question about subjects.
But, you know, up until year 11, so funding for early years is good, then primary goes down, and then years 11 to, up until the age 16 it goes up, and then the final 2 years of school it goes down again, vocational goes down even further, and then it's all over the place, and there's no logic.
Well, I'm going to turn to Sam. Do we have a strategy? Did we have a strategy? What would you do to develop a strategy for education funding that didn't end up with some of these challenges?
I think I wanted to make a point about supply and sort of on what Lorraine was saying about the sort of the market. I think that has clearly not worked, and it's not worked because universities are not competing on quality; they're competing on status, and they're competing on certification, and that is the only way you can possibly explain the massive increase in the number of firsts being handed out when there hasn't been any change in A-level results over the last sort of 15 years. And that has, I think, in return, had negative quality impacts and destabilised various institutions. The problem is if you start putting caps back, you still don't have quality measures. On what basis are you deciding the caps? So like the lack of good quality metrics and the difficulty of creating them, I'm not pretending it would be easy to create them at all, it would be very, very hard, is a really big problem, which we don't have in schools to the same degree, although it causes tensions. So I think I did want to sort of bring that in. I think on the other thing I want to say, the sort of question about that we had about professions. And I do think it is mad that we have a massive teacher shortage, and yet we are asking people to take another £9,000 of loans to do a PGCE when we desperately need more teachers. That doesn't make any sense.
And the repayment system, which we've designed, could not be the new one could not be better designed to punish teachers.
So I certainly think for professions where we have a shortage, you do have to look at having some common sense as to the fact we're putting people off and not even getting all that much money back from them because they've already obviously got to pay off an undergraduate loan first. So yeah, I thought that was a good point.
So Johnny at the back there, and then the speaker here. This one here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Johnny Rich. I wanted to pick up on Sam and Ed's comment in their opening remarks about Sam saying that it's either students who pay or it's the taxpayer who pay, and Ed saying, and I agree with this, that it's actually a tripartite arrangement and that employers have a role. And given the research First has done on the popularity of employers having a role in funding, and Pepe's research on the paper I recently wrote, suggesting that this would be more popular amongst applicants as well, and that it would save £8 billion to the exchequer at each cohort. What is the role for graduate employers in funding the system?
Okay, so we had a political response to that when Ed mentioned it. I'll come back to you, Ed, in a moment. Can we have an economics view on an employer?
Gosh, I don't think we'd agree.
No, that's fine. Okay, two economics views.
Well,
Employer levies, and it's not quite what we were discussing earlier, I don't think, because it isn't completely, well, it's just the employer taking the tax. It's an employer would incur this additional, say, charge or whatever you want to call it, only when employing graduates. So the obvious question, at least to me, is, does that mean that that makes you less inclined to employ graduates? Is that a helpful thing to do? Let's take your view and then...
Don't graduates make more than non-graduates, and that's why we're pushing everybody to go to university? Employers do pay more for people with graduate degrees. We just don't call it an employer levy. It goes to this is the incentive that people have to go get a degree. So employers in a free labor market, this is where the market I think actually works, people get a degree and they go out there and they can get more money than if they didn't have a degree. So call that an employer levy if you want to, but that's
so
part of the market thing.
Hang on a second, let's push the psychology of it, right? So we have a psychological issue with rising student debt that's causing people to say tuition fees can't go up, it's a real problem, etc. Is the psychological burden, if you like, of an employer levy quite distinct from the perspective of someone who's sitting there debating whether to go to university or whose parents are thinking about whether they would think that's a good idea?
I think the unintended consequences of an employer levy would probably be freaking enormous. You know, you'd probably introduce it for a certain cohort of students and not another, and you'd have all sorts of swapping between generations of who was getting jobs and who was not. This is industrial policy, right? And the planning, like what kind of degrees we give out in what fields, and getting input. You know, we're getting sort of back to what all of us neoliberal governments ran away from, which is industrial policy, planning the economy, employer levy. How many slots should we have in engineering, right? So I really don't think that there's actually a way to employer our way out of this. I think the government has to do it. And progressive taxation is a way that we get more money to give to institutions. Mm-hmm. So there's two equivalent ways to fund post-secondary education, tertiary education. One is that this generation that's working right now pays for the young people to go to school. That's what we do with K-12, right? You pay for them to go to school. And then the idea is that when they grow up, they'll do the same thing for the next generation. And this is kind of an intergenerational compact. Who runs the intergenerational compact? The government, right? So this idea that individuals should be responsible for their own schooling prices is a fairly new one. Absolutely. And historically, we didn't do it that way. We've got this sort of jumble of progressive, not progressive systems. In a perfect world, I think we just go back to tax and spend and do it that way. And yes, you have to hammer it out through politics, and it's class warfare, whether the university gets more money or it doesn't. But here we go.
Okay, clear view. Lorraine, briefly.
Okay, I mean, so I think this, I knew this was in the public domain, and I sent an email around to people like Ben and Jack and stuff like that. I'm just wondering, because we have an interesting system here. We have a national insurance system and a tax system. And there's employer national insurance and there's employee national insurance. So employee national insurance is just like income tax, and it's just based on the pay you get in the month. I wonder if, just to make the optics look better, you could have a slightly higher employer national insurance rate if they've got a graduate with an outstanding student loan. A very, very small increase. So it is like a progressive tax increase. It might, but of course, doing that, it depends on incidence. If the employer passes it all on to the student in terms of reducing wages, then it's effectively going on the student. So it's really a question of incidence. You can tax the employer, but will they just reduce wages? I think perhaps there is a way of doing it, and maybe it would raise a bit of money, but I'm going to leave the colleagues at the IFS to model it.
Okay, so we have a question here. Go for it.
Can I quickly say something? Sorry, just to say.
Sorry,
that's all right. No, the public supports it, like the idea of it. Well, it's because they're not paying it, right? And I honestly can't see a conceivable way why.
There's no way on earth the Treasury are going to agree to that in a million years.
Especially with the productivity crisis. They're not going to, no, I can't see it in a million years.
Yeah.
And some of those low-skilled graduates might not feel that great about being marginalised out even further in their low-wage jobs and not being paid. Right.
Hi, I'm Joanna Burton. I'm from the Russell Group. So there's been a lot of good conversation about the financial challenges facing universities, and a lot of that is driven by the funding decisions that have been made, rising costs. And I would add to that the growing expectations on universities, both from governments, from students themselves, and not to mention some of the unhelpful rhetoric that comes from government about low-value degrees and wider immigration decisions that have made our country perhaps less attractive to international students. I agree with Sam's point that there won't be any more money for HE in this government or the next one. Nonetheless, not funding HE and not addressing the financial challenges is a political decision. So my question that I'd be interested in thoughts on is, given that, what is the government's role in helping to manage universities facing these financial difficulties? And we're starting to see already universities throughout the sector taking the decisions in terms of rationalising courses, redundancies, and making those changes to adapt to financial challenges. Is there some sort of role for some sort of coordination of that? Because what we could potentially see is cold spots in provision in certain regions of the countries where universities are closing departments or, God forbid, failing altogether. So what role does government have there?
Sam, do you want to kick off that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I would say I don't think this is a forever situation. I think that the government will eventually fund HE more, and it will fund it at exactly the point when the middle classes realise that their children are not going to be able to go to university. Particularly the deputy editor of the Daily Telegraph or of the Times realises that will happen much sooner. So I think it's more of a sort of bridging problem than an always problem, although it's always going to be hard to make the case versus other priorities. So when in my sort of imaginary options paper for a new Secretary of State, when I talk about that sort of third option, which is you sort of say we're not going to do anything on tuition fees, very unpopular, but we do feel we need to do something. Let's set up a £200 million transformation fund. That's kind of what I'm imagining it doing. Is rather than just sort of giving a little bit out to everybody, you say we're going to try and identify where you've got universities that are really in trouble. Not just give them a total bailout because of the moral hazard, but say. How can we use this money strategically to help you, whether that's a merger, whether that's a sort of change in structure, whether it's changing, whatever it is, let's come up with a plan. It's a bit more statist than I would like, but I kind of think that's probably the most likely thing that's going to happen of all the options.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I can't conceive of a situation when a government will let a university of substance actually go bust. I mean, not least of all because we don't even know what that looks like or how that works. And in most places, even London, they are, major employers, and the job losses alone would be very, very hard to bear. Imagine a place like Norwich. It's sort of inconceivable.
It's happened. There was a London university.
Can you use the microphone? Can you use the microphone?
It has actually happened. There was a London college which was doing, I think, mainly things like philosophy and theology that was attached or not attached to one of the London university colleges, which actually did close down. So it has actually happened there, and in the private sector, it would certainly seem to be quite possible to happen. I mean, I'm not quite sure where the sort of redundancies which we talk about have taken place here are going to get a bit bigger somewhere else. So I think that is something which we need. I don't know if I'm allowed...
Thank you for that one. We're going to press on with the questions if we may. Yeah, there's a question at the back there.
Yeah,
we'll come back to that issue. And there are a couple of questions in the chat while we line up that speaker, all of which are related to FE and the lifelong learning entitlement. Basically, do you think that the lifelong learning entitlement, by giving people the option to borrow for their FE, is part of the solution, is one aspect to it? The other aspect is the supply, which is basically bits of FE already had the level 4 and 5, you could already get a loan for, but what also happened was that the universities tended to go for the 9K provision because you get more for it than sticking with some of the vocational courses that you couldn't attract the 9K fee. So to what extent is the lifelong learning entitlement a solution, and also how much of this is driven by if you put incentives in front of universities or indeed any institutions, they respond naturally to what's on the table, so to speak. Anyone over here? Lifelong learning? No views?
Well, I mean, it's so vague. I mean, until we know the details, I mean, there's such a risk of it being exploited if it's not well regulated.
Okay, so we could drop 2 data points in here, which is one, we've already had loans for adult learning that had very, very low, not to say minimal, zero take-up. So first of all, I'm not sure there's an appetite for students to take that up. And then the second thing on the lifelong learning entitlement is what are you, as Sue rightly puts, drawing people into, and what does that look like for their risk appetite? And I'm not sure that, as it's described, we really know the answer to how that...
And I mean, we're already seeing in universities the risk of getting private providers in to provide provision and them getting a cut and students complaining about it. I think there's an issue with the universities, and you just, again, regulating it in a good way. In Australia, when you introduced loans for vocational education, you had these private providers pop up, go to nursing homes, say, take out a loan, we'll give you an iPad, and ran away with the money. So it's,
Yeah.
I could add one.
As we had here in 2011, was it, with the individual learning accounts? Right, sorry to keep you...
Hi, I'm sorry I'm hogging it. That's the third question. As unusual. In answer to what Susan said, I want to ask a question.
I said a lot of things. Which one?
I'll explain in a minute. Thanks.
Okay.
I have to ask something to Sam and Ed. I've written quite a lot about using national insurance for several years for payment, and I had a recent blog. It's under the title, it's in Total Equality for Students. You can look it up. And about 2 months ago, I think I wrote quite a detailed appraisal of what would happen to national insurance and modelled it. Interestingly, UCU with London Economics have just put out a detailed modelling of using national insurance employer contribution to pay for it. So the question at the end of the day, Sam and Ed, do you think it's viable to have national insurance increase for students or employees and employers increased by, say, it would be about 1 to 1.2%. And that would be a lifetime charge. And it would go up with inflation, pay inflation at least, and it would be highly progressive and only tax earnings and not other forms of taxation. Do you think that is a runner with the public and with government?
Okay, so that's coming back to the question that we ran a minute ago about employer levies and NI charges. Before we turn to that, Susan, you were going to comment about this lifelong learning entitlement and whether the principle of what we're trying to do here in the UK makes sense.
I guess I would, providing liquidity, loans to students, or for that matter, grants to students, if the goal is to increase access and you don't think about the supply side, you're going to have disasters. So, basically, if the government wants to grow the further education sector by 75,000 students, it needs to, at the same time, have a strategy for providers that can teach 75,000 students. And I feel like the lifetime loan setup is sort of focusing too much on one side of the market and not thinking about the other side of the market.
Which is consistent with what happened last time with a whole load of private provision coming in.
Magically, these schools will appear.
So I think the verdict on the lifelong learning entitlement is we need more detail, sorry people online, but also being very careful, regulating quality, but also thinking if the supply of good quality stuff is not there, then that's when you get the highest risk of the private sector coming in. Right, now let's return to the favourite topic of getting other people to pay for this, i.e. employers. Is this...
I just don't think, if you hang around politics too long, you can get overly cynical and miss opportunities. But
No.
I just don't see, I don't see the Treasury ever agreeing to put up national insurance for employers to pay for a specific variegated thing like that. And I think the politics of it, when graduates realise what it would mean for their employment opportunities, would be horrible. I cannot see that flying, either from a political or a Treasury perspective.
Anything you wanted to add to that, Ed?
I agree with that.
Oh, there you go. There's a question online, and then we'll come to the speaker there. Yep, brilliant, thank you. Question online was, don't many European countries have examples of sustainable funding systems? No fees, full grant funding, much less expensive universities, still fairly high participation rates, and universities less obsessed with chasing research-based league tables. We've not really touched on that issue yet, but more generally, are there European systems that we should be learning from rather than US, UK, Australia, Chile? What else have we had today? Quite a few.
Well, I think Germany's an interesting example because they tried to introduce fees and then abolished it quite quickly when there was student protests. But there's interesting work by Ludger Grossman, who basically thinks that the sort of measuring of the reaction was all based on the students, and when it was explained properly to the public and students, they were more favourable. However, so there is limited taxpayer money even in Germany. So what do they do? From my understanding, and excuse me if I've got this wrong, I think the bar to get to first year study is really low and anybody can access it. But to make progress, they cull ruthlessly to keep costs down. I think that's the way they do it. So I mean, you know, I mean, we've got Scotland with free higher education, and the latest, Kate's the expert here, but it comes at a cost of massive reduction in funding for students. Kate's much better. And
number caps, absolutely, because it can't be. Question at the back there.
I just wanted to ask about the MAC review. So I think now we can expect a decision on the graduate route within the next week or so. I just wanted to get the thoughts of the panel as to, excuse me, how important they think the graduate route is to funding conversation, and also where it fits into what Ed was talking about, kind of the war for public support, and how important international students are to that.
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, the evidence I see talking to people and polling them is I actually don't see international students as part of the sort of ground war in terms of public opinion. And I think Labour, where Labour are on that, I can't see them encouraging a kind of increase in the number of international students. I think that would be really challenging politically. I can see them attempting to establish a level of normality at where we are now that at least avoids more universities potentially going belly up.
And more predictability, perhaps,
Yeah.
about the system, which would be perhaps most valuable.
I will add that in the U.S., international students have become a key funding mechanism for institutions that have had dropping government support. So you can see in states that have had a drop-off in state support that basically in-state students have been replaced by out-of-state students is one source. So if you are in Massachusetts and want to go to a public school, public institution in Michigan, you pay the same amount as somebody who's coming from China, right? So, and that's how we're balancing our budgets. And it's kind of perverse because the local taxpayers paid all the fixed costs of creating these institutions, and they're giving away the marginal seats because the government's not giving them enough to keep them.
I just want to say on the MAC report, I agree with Ed that Labour will, I think, just try and keep the status quo. But I think that depends on what the status quo is when they get in. Yeah, and I think that the biggest difficulty for them will be if the government decide, despite today's report, to nevertheless try and do something on the graduate visa before the election. If they put it in the manifesto, not a problem. If they try and do something in the next week or two, then and the only reason that they would do that is precisely to create a problem for Labour. Do they then reverse that? I suspect they probably would, but they probably wouldn't want to say so before the election.
A tricky one, yeah.
Hi, my name is Cassie Hugo. I'm from Martingale Foundation. So we fund masters and PhDs for students, domestic students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So unsurprisingly, my question is related to the end of the pipeline, looking more at those postgraduate degrees. Masters currently is unregulated, and it often is a revenue-raising mechanism for universities. And we're seeing more and more master's courses crop up. We're seeing more and more students access masters, particularly since loans came in for those master's degrees. However, on the other end, we've also got the Conservative government saying they want to be a science and technology superpower, and Labour is in turn saying similar things, not necessarily the same buzzwords, but you're not seeing that kind of pipeline regulation. So my question is, do you think that in any kind of reform on regulation or funding you might start to consider PGT within that, or do you think that will continue to be kind of left to the university's own devices?
That's a good question, particularly as most of the, well, not most, but a large chunk of the international students we're talking about are on taught master's provision rather than on undergraduate. Does anybody want to come in on that one?
Well, you've got a real problem for domestic participation in master's degrees, particularly at elite universities. I mean, you know, there's master's degrees at UCL, quite common, £32,000 a year for domestic and international students, and you can get a loan for £10,000 to do a master's degree. So what you find on a lot of these masters is it's predominantly overseas students. So there is a real problem route for domestic students into master's degree. I've got a son, he went to Barcelona to do his master's degree. I mean, it is really a problem with for domestic students to access. The ESRC has introduced funding for 1+3 routes, so there is a route, but the number of funding places available is very, very small. So we do have a big problem, and you see it reflected in the number of domestic students doing masters and PhDs. So
yeah, and I mean, forgive the blatant plug, but my own organisation, the Alleviate Trust, we've done a new scheme or introduced a new scheme precisely because of that, in the sense that we know there's a funding issue, not so much accessing PGT, but if you want that superpower focused on research, you're going to need research masters through to PhD. And that means really we're going to have to find 5 years of funding at least, and we put in some additional funding to help black and low income students in particular, because if you are going to your master's degree in your local university and it's a PGT, that's going to get you potentially nowhere near the research route that you might be, you know, capable of being, you know, the next talented genius in whatever subject you want to study. So it's important that we have these. So I think you've identified a sort of systemic problem. And if you were looking at the funding, absolutely that should be in it. Anything you want to add on the politics of postgraduate versus undergraduate? Because it's an interesting...
I mean, I think, again, sort of going to which groups have the most, sort of the loudest voice in British politics, you have an issue where increasingly large numbers of graduate jobs, the best graduate jobs, require a master's degree, and yet it's very difficult to get funding for a master's degree unless you are from a, you know, have a lot of support from parents. And I think that might start to create a bit of noise around the issue over time, around domestic funding. But it is a much smaller group, obviously, than undergraduate, so it's never going to be as big a political priority. And as we've already discussed, there are many, many of those around at the moment. So.
And it speaks to Claire and Jill's work, where you see there's not a massive gap in terms of participation at undergraduate level by income. It's all about achievement. That's not true at masters. And so that's the next kind of frontier of social mobility. We've got time for 2 more questions, and we'll take them in quick succession. There's one there. I'm sorry, you've already spoken, so I'm going to be rude and do one over there. Do you want to get the microphone down? Thank you. Thanks very much for running around. Go for it.
Thank you very much. Real quick question primarily for Sam and Ed. Is polling destiny in terms of these priorities, or is it that the sector hasn't been communicating as effectively as some of these other priority groups? So, I mean, if you want to take an esoteric group with complex needs, like the City of London, government still understands them quite well, and that's because they put a lot of active effort into communicating that. Is it that the sector hasn't been doing that, or is it that it's not possible for the sector to do that, or is it that it's not desirable for the sector to do that?
Thank you for that. Claire, do you want to do your question reasonably briefly?
Yeah, just one quick reflection and one question. So one reflection as someone who works in early years is I'm struck by how similar the debate is here to what we're going to be having in the early years sector that we're starting now because of the big expansion, and that will only come into greater fruition as the reform kind of rolls out. I won't say more on that, but the question is, obviously teaching is only one part of what universities do. There are other things as well. Is there any scope for universities to be trying to lobby, if you want, for more funding for those other activities, research, etc., which are not so much in the political front line as tuition fees and so on?
Thanks, Claire. So I think the first question, you look like you wanted to take it, Ed. Go for it.
I don't think the sector does a particularly brilliant job of prosecuting its own case. I do think there's two sort of observations off the top of my head. One is that $9 grand a year or 27 grand a degree problem. It's just the overwhelming narrative when you're talking to normal people. You know, that is and sounds like lots of money. And the other issue, which is slightly prosaic, is that, you know, you can make a really strong argument that there is no HE sector. You know, the needs of post-92, even within the Russell Group, you know, what defines a Russell Group university? You've got a very broad sweep, which slightly relates to the postgraduate point, right, doesn't it? Which is, you know, the needs of the top of the Russell Group, whatever you mean by that, are very different to, you know, others. So I think just prosecuting the argument is very, very hard.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, because we've run out of time. Any comments?
I was going to just answer on the second question. I mean, the point about early years is absolutely right. Sorry, what was the other bit of the question?
Research and other things.
Yes, research. I think that no, if tuition fees are number 37 on the priority list, research budgets are probably number 78. You know, they're further down. The one thing you've got as an advantage when you're arguing for that is there isn't an economic benefit, so the Treasury is slightly more attracted by the sort of return on that. But I think, I know, when I've looked through lists of all of the different departmental spending, thinking what's going to be in trouble if they're in a really tight spending review, that one actually pops out as being one that you could end up seeing a bit reduced. So I don't think that's going to be the saviour. Yeah, I mean, on communications, I don't have much to add to Ed. I think it's quite a difficult case to sell. I think one thing that strikes me when I've been involved with universities, there's just a lot of defensiveness in the sector, which does come across and makes people looking in from the outside a bit more suspicious. So I think there's something about sort of coming at comms in a slightly less defensive way and being open about some of the problems there really are, because there are quality problems in some places. There are issues about regulation and so on. That would actually help, even though it seems counterintuitive to lead with some of your weaknesses.
Thank you, Sam. Susan, any comments? Anything, final words? Well, it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to our panel for a really interesting afternoon. Lots and lots of questions, not all the answers, but we get somewhere, I think. And thank you for coming.